Okay, Alex, it's all yours.
Off we go. So thank everybody. Thanks for tuning in on during a sort of after dinner time presentation. I'm very excited to meet new people, and I always love chatting with other folks at different Audubon chapters. And so, quick background about me. It sounds like you already got a little bit from Sal here, but I am very passionate about Mojave Desert conservation. Selling the desert to people as a place that should be conserved is a pretty difficult task. It's not the same as a lush forest with water nearby or a place with a lot of wetlands or a coastal location. So it's a little bit trickier. And over the last few years, I've been working more in education outreach and trying to show people how wonderful this desert ecosystem is. And so a little bit about my background here in the Mojave. Sal already covered a little bit, but came out here in 2015 working in renewables. There's a famous site between Nevada and California, right on the county line near Prim, Nevada, off of I-15 that kills a lot of birds. And so I went out there and was essentially doing bird forensics at this site. And fortunately, this type of solar is not very viable. So we won't see many of that type in the future, but I still stuck around. And after I decided to leave field work, I decided to switch gears and do my own education and outreach. And Red Rock Audubon found a way to make that happen for me. So that's been really cool. So let's dive in. So during this presentation, you can expect to have a better understanding of what makes the Mojave Desert, and what local habitats we have, our different plant communities, and what makes them distinct. You'll have a better appreciation for the patterns of behavior and movement here in the Mojave Desert. They'll be quite similar to what you have in California because we share a lot of the same birds and we're sort of at similar latitudes here. We'll talk about the challenges facing birds here in the Mojave and what you can do, and whether that's something you can do here or back at home, wherever that is, probably Central California. Our birds are connected, our habitats are connected. What we do here benefits you all, and what you do there benefits us and our birds. So I will try to sell the Mojave Desert to you all. You're interested enough to make this presentation, so we're halfway there. Okay, so what makes the Mojave Desert versus any of these other deserts? So on the left-hand side, you have a map of the 4 North American deserts, and you'll see that closest to you is the Mojave Desert. If you were to go to over the east side of the Sierra and into Death Valley, you would be in Mojave Desert. If you went down to Joshua Tree National Park, you would be right at the edge of Mojave Desert. And then just south of there, you'd have Sonoran Desert and what some people call the Colorado Desert. In the northern part of Nevada, we have the Great Basin. This is a much colder desert and receives a lot more snowfall than we do here. And of course, then if you go to El Paso or White Sands, New Mexico, Big Bend National Park, you have the Chihuahuan Desert. Now, for us here in the Mojave Desert, we are a hot and dry desert. We receive about 4 inches of precipitation annually. Most of that is rainfall. We get snow every now and then, especially in some of our higher peaks, but we get far less precipitation here than the Sonoran and far less precipitation here than the Great Basin. The Great Basin gets a lot more snowfall than we do. And so water sources are few and far between, and many of our migratory birds are looking for water as they're moving through the region. And so they'll be stopping at riparian areas and valleys where you might have cottonwoods and willows, or they're using some of our mountain peaks nearby. And maybe you've been to Las Vegas in the past and looked off just northwest of Las Vegas, where I am right now, and seen the Spring Mountains. And the Spring Mountains are just a classic Nevada mountain range. We have different plant communities all the way up there. And much like the Sierra, in the spring and the summer, we have a lot of snow melt happening. And that snow melt is going to contribute to seasonal springs and riparian areas, little creeks and drips. And all those things are very important to migratory birds and the birds that breed up there. So let's talk about topography and relief, and we'll talk about those plant communities for just a little bit, and then we'll talk about what happens throughout a year in the Mojave. So right now we're talking about some spatial stuff, and then we'll talk about some temporal stuff, and then hopefully that all congeals for you right at the end to help you bring these two things together. So let's start at that bottom right. We have these. I'm not an artist, but I had a lot of fun making these on a PowerPoint presentation here. Very basic, but hopefully you get the idea. If you start at the bottom right, you have my rendition of a riparian area with cottonwoods. Think of summer tanagers, yellow-breasted chats, Bell's vireos. We might have breeding red-shouldered hawks. They're starting to move in here. And Buick's wrens, Abert's towhees, Gambel's quails, all those birds will be found in those riparian areas. If you move away from riparian areas and stay in lowlands, but far away from water, you start to see creosote. That's going to be a dominant shrub. You've probably seen that many times when you go into desert areas. You'll see in flat valleys, scattered shrubs, kind of spaced apart, certain width or length apart. That's because they actually will they have these adaptations to help prevent other creosotes from growing nearby or other plants growing nearby. So if you've ever noticed that, those are probably creosotes. Going up into the Joshua tree and blackbrush communities. So now we're moving up in elevation where it's going to be a little bit cooler. You're going to find Joshua trees. Joshua trees are an indicator species for the Mojave Desert. So we don't have a lot of indicator species here, but we do have the Joshua tree. So the range of the Joshua tree is roughly the range of the Mojave Desert. And so that indicator species is going to indicate to you that you are in the Mojave Desert now. Moving up, we have pinyon juniper woodlands. That's where we get, spotted towhee, bush tit, juniper titmouse, and a couple other birds. I'll show you some slides in just a moment of some other amazing birds that live in pinyon juniper woodlands. And then moving up, we see some plants that maybe you're more familiar with if you go to the Sierra. We've got aspens and ponderosa pine. Get up a little higher, you get your bristlecone pines. And then finally, we actually do have some alpine zones in some of our higher peaks in the Mojave Desert. So I put some birds where I thought they might belong. We've got black-throated sparrows in the lowlands. Mountain bluebirds can be virtually anywhere, but they typically like to be in the Joshua tree and blackbrush communities. Spotted towhee, canyon wren, white-throated swift, goshawks we have just outside of Las Vegas, peregrine falcons, and red-tailed hawks. So Mojave, just like anywhere, you want to pay attention to elevation and general landscape features. And I advise people to learn the most common plants, or the 5 most common plants, wherever they go, because you're going to, when you do that, you will quickly start to identify the habitat that you're in. Those first 5 common plants are going to really dominate that landscape under most conditions. And so, of course, there's a connection with plants to the animals, and the animals and the plants have a connection to the climate of that area. And so we have here in the Mojave, just like most places in the West, deserts, mountains, they're going to play a huge role in local climate. So let's talk about a couple birds that we have in the lowlands. We have a bird that is now known as the sagebrush sparrow, but it used to be the sage sparrow because it was formerly conspecific with a bird now known as the bell sparrow. I can't remember if bell sparrows get that far north towards where you are, but I've definitely seen them in LA County and Ventura County. They look quite similar, but with, stronger facial markings than the sagebrush sparrow. And our sagebrush sparrows, they like to overwinter in saltbush communities here in the Mojave Desert. So anywhere that's low, but the soil too salty for creosote to survive. And then we have a similar looking bird to that sagebrush sparrow. We have plenty of black-throated sparrows. And I love this bird. When I visited Phoenix, when I was in the 7th grade with my parents, I saw 2 black-throated sparrows drinking water from a leaky fountain at Mount Camelback near Scottsdale, Arizona. And that's when I knew that I wanted to live in the desert someday. I was visiting from Florida at the time, and I just fell in love with these little birds. We have, in some areas moving a little higher in elevation, we start to see mesquite plants and mesquite trees, and you can see them here in kind of the background. If you look on the left-hand side of the frame there, you'll see some very orange clusters in a tree. And that is going to be your desert mistletoe. The desert mistletoe is growing in that honey mesquite. And here's a connection here. It's very fascinating. So a lot of the Mojave Desert has lots of groundwater. And we have actually in Las Vegas so much groundwater that people are able to establish a city here. And we've depleted a lot of our groundwater, but we still had plenty here, and we still have some. And so mesquite trees have this remarkable adaptation where their roots can get down into about 100 to 120 feet deep and access some of that groundwater and saturated soil. And so healthy honey mesquites can harbor a parasitic plant called the desert mistletoe. And the desert mistletoe is that orange stuff that I showed you in that last photo. Now, the desert mistletoe is important to a bird that has a very fun name. I'm sure many of you have seen them or you'd like to see one. This is the phainopepla. This is the phainopepla. And they've got these blood red eyes and these really cool crests. They are a member of the silky flycatcher family. They're not a true Tyranidae or New World flycatcher like a Empedonax or an ash-throated flycatcher or a kingbird. They're not related to that. These are silky flycatchers, and there are only a few of them in the tropics. And this is the only one that we get in the United States. And like the ones that live in the tropics, they love to eat fruit, and they love to eat the fruit of that desert mistletoe. So the desert mistletoe relies on the phainopepla because they will eat the fruit and then fly off to another honey mesquite and poop on a branch. And then maybe the seed that they just pooped out will germinate onto another honey mesquite. So the bird relies on the desert mistletoe. The desert mistletoe relies on the bird, and both of them rely on the honey mesquite. Moving up into elevation, we start to see some trees, and around there, we're going to start looking for cactus wrens. This is not like Phoenix or, oh, somebody is not on mute if you don't mind muting yourself. So it's not like Phoenix or Tucson where we have saguaro cactus. We have Joshua trees in a lot of places, and that's the preferred habitat for the cactus wren. Moving higher up, you start to get into some pinyon juniper communities. So that's pinyon pine and Utah juniper. What it looks like. Up there, we get woodhouses, jays, and the gray vireo. And then finally, getting a little higher up, you get into some ponderosa pine and aspen, where you get these really fun birds that I'm sure you've seen in the Sierra. We'll talk about them a little later. Okay, so that was moving up in elevation from the lowest elevations to about the highest. But let's talk about, sort of the annual pattern that we have here in the Mojave Desert and try to relate them back to what you see in Central California. I'm sure you'll find a lot of similarities. So in March through late May, I consider that spring migration and breeding. So it doesn't always work out that on March 21st, that's when the spring begins. And then it goes all the way to June 21st. And that's when summer officially begins. We know as birders that that's not the way that it works, right? So I think of it as functional spring migration, and functional breeding is going to be March through late May. So our waterfowl, they always start to move out right about now. So next time I head out, I'll pay a little more attention to them because I know I won't see them for a while, at least here. And early breeding actually begins early in January. We have some birds begin to sing right after Christmas because they can register that there's more light coming back to the northern hemisphere. So that begins quite early. And the dam will break at some point, and we'll start to get many of the birds that very well. We'll start to have black-headed grosbeaks and Bullock's orioles, lazuli buntings. We'll start to get our Wilson's warblers, McGillivray's warblers, western wood peewees, all that fun stuff. And that's when we can have some really big days in Las Vegas. I don't have the desire to do a lot of big days anymore, but every now and then I get sucked into it. But people that I know or friends of mine can get out there, and just around Las Vegas, they're getting 160, 170 species in one day in around May 10th, May 15th. That's when we get the highest diversity. It takes a lot of planning and, of course, and a lot of driving, but people do it. So here's some waterfowl taken off. You see here some northern pintails. We'll start to get some of our shorebirds coming back too. So we'll have birds with lesser yellowlegs returning from their wintering locations in Southern California, all across parts of Mexico. They're going to pass through on their way to the boreal forests and in Alaska and Canada, and they'll be breeding in the tops of spruce trees up there, singing from the tops of spruce trees, and their nests will be on the grounds in a bog nearby. But they're passing through here, like they're moving through your areas in some small numbers. So this is a lesser yellowlegs taken at a wash in the Las Vegas area just a couple years ago. We'll get some of our beautiful bright warblers passing through again too. So we'll get our black-throated gray warblers and our Wilson's warblers. I mean, look at how fresh that Wilson's warbler looks there. I will admit that I took both of these photos in Southern California, but we get both of these birds here quite regularly. So I decided to throw them up there. These are the best ones I have. Black-headed grosbeaks pass through. I love a good photo with the moon in the background, so I decided to throw that up. And then for us here, I'm sure it's the same way for you, but we're in the Mojave Desert, and it doesn't get much warmer than the Mojave Desert in the summertime. So by late May, moving into August, it's summer, and it is difficult for us here to get out and go birding. So we get out very early, or we get out to some of the mountains, or some of us just simply leave the region. Some of us just go somewhere else, run the AC, and daydream of fall. So our summer is very much staggered elevationally. So what I mean by that is that as you move up in elevation or altitude, your summer is going to arrive later and later. So down where I am right now in the center of Las Vegas, we're starting to see some of our mulberry trees. They're starting to put out some early buds. They're starting to put out catkins. The trees will start to be pollinated very soon. And some of our early migratory birds will start to move in and feed on insects that are now coming out in sync with the photosynthesis and plant production. Now, it's still very much winter up in the mountains that I mentioned earlier, and we won't actually see some of the aspens leafing out up there for many more weeks. And so, of course, breeding activity is going to be a lot later over there. If we get a good rain year, we might have birds breed several times. We have lots of young birds. I tell people, get to know the calls and their plumage, get to know those neighborhood birds really well, because you don't have a lot of diversity, but you have a lot of really interesting behavior that you can observe. And we'll get some post-breeding dispersal in late July or August. So that's exactly what it sounds like. Not a lot of people talk about post-breeding dispersal, but it's that time period between birds fledging and leaving their nests and the adults no longer having young to raise, but too early before migration. And so they're just fattening up and kind of wandering around. And so what will have happen, for example, here is we'll have in late July or August, we'll have Western tanagers move out of the mountains where they breed. They're not quite migrating, but they move into the valley to take advantage of a lot of the food items that they have in when wetlands near Las Vegas. It's really cool to see. So in the summer, we're kept up at night by this bird, the northern mockingbird. You all know this one, I'm sure. Who doesn't? And we have some pretty hardy birds that are just able to manage to survive in some of the very hot conditions. We have our canyon wren on the left and our rock wren on the right. And I have to tell you, the song of the canyon wren is one of the most beautiful sounds I have ever heard. If you have not gotten out there and heard a canyon wren sing, it's something that I really recommend you get out there and do. I don't know how close the closest canyon wrens are to you all in Modesto, but they're definitely in at least the east side of the Sierra in some areas at the right elevation. I don't know if they're on the west side, but you can't be that far away from them. And such a beautiful song that they have. I mentioned that I'd come back to these birds, and I love these birds so much, the Clark's nutcracker and the pygmy nuthatch. And these are two birds that are living in our ponderosa pine and limber pine communities, higher elevation here. And I want to talk about the Clark's nutcracker for just a moment. And this bird here is a scatter hoarder. That is a strategy for, that's a strategy that they employ for finding food and stashing it later for later consumption. So Clark's nutcrackers are they're corvids. So they're in the same family as jays, as crows, as ravens, as magpies. These are some of our most intelligent birds in the world. They have incredible problem-solving skills, and some of them also have incredible spatial memory. And so one of the things that the Clark's nutcracker can do is it can spend much of the late summer and fall finding fresh pine cones and stashing them or the seeds from those pine cones all across the landscape. And they'll move through in these family groups and spend weeks doing that. And they're stashing these things for finding later and for later consumption in the wintertime, especially when there's a lot of snow covering the ground. So that's how they're able to survive. And you've probably seen this behavior with woodpeckers, with chickadees, with nuthatches. These are the things that these birds are doing in the late summer and the fall in order to survive through that winter when it's very cold, the days are very short, and finding food is difficult when there's snow on the ground. The pinyon jay does something very similar. The pinyon jay is a scatter hoarder, and it does more or less the same thing as the Clark's nutcracker, but a slightly lower elevation. And so here is a pinyon jay taking off with a fresh green pinyon pine cone. If you look closely at that pine cone, it's still green. And that bird is flying off to go stash it somewhere for later consumption, which is really amazing. Now, the pinyon jay, just like the Clark's nutcracker, they have these intimate connections with these specific coniferous trees. Just like the phainopepla moves the desert mistletoe around, the pinyon jay moves around the pinyon pine. And so the pinyon pine will be harvested by pinyon jays, and they're going to deposit lots of the seeds all across the landscape. Sometimes they put them in the soil and forget where they are, or maybe the bird dies, something happens to it. Whatever the cause, they have just planted a seed for a new pinyon pine, and that has a chance of growing up into another pinyon pine that will feed future generations of jays. Now we have a problem here in Nevada and anywhere that the pinyon jay is found, and that is that their population is crashing. We've lost about 80% of our pinyon jays in about 50 years. and about half the population lives in Nevada. So what this means for the pinyon pine community is yet to be determined, but I have to imagine, most people imagine, but of course we as scientists we can't say for certain until it's happened. We've collected the data that that it's not going to be a good turnout for the pinyon pine. So we don't know. But this is something that we're really thinking about here as conservationists. Like, how do we get to the bottom of this, and is there something that can be done? So that's what we're working on. One of the things we're working on. So let's move into that end of or mid-August, go into September and late October. This is fall migration. And the first birds that we get here are probably like the same birds that you get in California. This is kind of the theme all across North America. And these are our early returning fall species, our shorebirds. And we'll start to get some maybe marbled godwits or snowy plovers, or we might get some yellow legs in late July. Definitely by August, they're starting to show up in force. Most of them are adults to start. And we think that the adults that show up first are failed breeders. These are the ones that went up into Alaska or Canada and let's say they arrived in May. They attempted to breed. Maybe they did find a mate and have eggs, but a fox ate the eggs. And the summer season is so short up there that they generally won't try again. It'll be like a one and done thing. Some of them might have two clutches, I'm not sure, but they take advantage of those very long summer days to feed their young, and the young grow quite quickly because they're being fed, sometimes for 20 or 21, 24 hours a day around summer solstice. Up in Barrow, it's nothing but daylight. So those birds, they generally come down. The younger shorebirds, they need time to fatten up and learn how to, feed on their own well and migrate down. So they generally arrive a little later. That's probably going to be the same thing for you in the fall. The shorebirds you get later on in the fall are going to be your young ones. Our insectivores, they start to move south. And this makes sense because they are trying to avoid too many cold fronts or a really aggressive, harsh cold front that could come in September or October. They're starting to arrive later and later, and they're not as harsh, but still, it is still part of the instinct of these birds to move away as it gets colder, because when it gets colder, insect activity diminishes. So something like a vireo or a warbler, a flycatcher, most of them are going to want to get out of Nevada before it gets too cool. So we see them first. We'll get things like sharp-shinned hawks and Cooper's hawks. They'll be following them. We know that accipiters love to feed on birds. So when songbird migration picks up, we'll start to see some of our accipiters move through. And then we'll get some of our later arrivals. This is probably quite similar to what you have in October. So we'll get our kinglets back and our bluebirds, robins, hermit thrushes. A lot of sparrows will come down. White-crowned sparrows just take over for a little bit. And I love those birds. And they'll come down a little later in the fall. And this makes sense too, right? Because they can feed on seeds. And as long as an area is not covered by snow, many of these birds can feed on seeds or fruit, right? Like robins and bluebirds, they can eat fruit. They can eat not so much seeds that they need to crack, but they'll also eat plenty of invertebrates. They generally are generalists. So all the birds at the very bottom there, they can survive here in the October, November, and through the winter generally. These are some of the shorebirds that we get here in Nevada in the fall. Although these birds are, I just noticed this. Many of these birds are in their breeding plumage, which you're not going to see in the fall that much, but they are coming down here in the fall and the spring. All these species at least. So top right, we have a long-billed dowitcher. At the bottom right, we have a very familiar bird. This is probably the shorebird that most people see for the first time in their lives when they see a shorebird. That's a killdeer. On the left-hand side, small, dingy brown backs with mostly clean, smudgy undersides. They have a beak that is not quite straight, but I wouldn't quite call it curved like a Dunlin or a Western Sandpiper with those yellow legs. These got to be Lee Sandpipers. And of course, we all know the beautiful American Avocet. Yellow-rumped warblers. These birds also take over. And we have plenty of them still in the area right now. They take over in October and definitely in November. And their numbers kind of go down as the wintertime gets harsher and harsher. I do think that they might be moving a little farther south gradually as the winter goes on. They certainly move down in elevation, especially when we start to lose many of our leaves that can persist into December. We'll get birds like the beautiful American kestrel. They breed here in the Mojave Desert. We actually have them in Las Vegas breeding here in our California fan palms. Northern flickers move through. We hail the flickers at the very southern part of the Mojave Desert. The Mojave National Preserve is the closest place for you to see them. That's in California. I don't think they're in Joshua Tree National Park, but you can definitely see them in Mojave National Preserve in Joshua Trees. We get mostly red-shafted flickers, just like you all, but we do get the occasional hybrid. I had a hybrid in my neighborhood between yellow-shafted and red-shafted flicker. And I mentioned these birds earlier, the white-crowned sparrow. So I just want to talk about these white-crowned sparrows just for a moment and just appreciate the amount of dialects that they have. And these are widespread birds. We have them all across California. You have them all the way up into Alaska and going east pretty much all the way to the east end of Canada and throughout the Rocky Mountains. You have a couple different subspecies, but what I find really interesting about them is, like some other sparrows, like juncos and fox sparrows, they have a wide array of dialects to the point that you can probably be in your, start birding in the morning in one place that they breed and drive 20 minutes to another site where they breed and hear a different dialect. But what they all have in common is they all have that introductory note, which is, and then they'll go something like that, some, arrangement of up and down phrases, but that first note is always the same. It's like the signature of the white-crowned sparrow. So despite all of the dialects that they would have, they all start with that same note. And when they're in the wintertime, all these populations are accumulating in the same places, and they start to sing in the wintertime, and they'll practice and tune up their song. And they're learning from, not really so much from one another. They learn a lot of their song actually from their nest site when they were still very young. But it's really cool to be in a place and actually hear the different dialects of these white-crowned sparrows when they're in a place where they're overwintering, because you have different populations. All right, so this is the season that we are just coming out of. Many of our insectivores are in the warmer Sonoran Desert, Mexico, Central America, even South America. Waterfowl are at their highest in the winter months. Our seed-eating birds, they can find food all winter, and our wetlands are very vibrant with life. So lots of waterfowl here in Southern Nevada, anywhere there's surface water. We'll have some of our geese around, and it's not just Canada geese here. We have cackling and the occasional snow geese. They love to be around grassy areas because geese are grazers, as I'm sure you're well aware of. They love to eat the tops of grass, but we also get a couple duck species like scoters. And we have Lake Mead here, a large reservoir. And of course, we have at some point along the way introduced a non-native bivalve, a mussel. And these types of diving ducks, they love to eat bivalves. They love to eat clams and hard-shelled organisms. So we're having an increasing number of scoters here in the Mojave, anywhere that you have the introduced quagga mussel, which is kind of a fascinating turn of events. Bald eagles, we even get these here. They love to eat the striped bass that live in some of our reservoirs. Um, the Nevada Department of Wildlife will put trout in some of the ponds and lakes, and they'll feed on those. And of course, in the winter months, we have this beautiful bird. This is the state bird of Nevada. You definitely get them in parts of California too, especially on the east side of the Sierra. What a gorgeous bird, the male mountain bluebird. And, I mentioned really amazing adaptations with some of our wintering birds in the mountains. The mountain chickadee is another one of those amazing birds that can survive up in the mountains because of that ability to scatter hoard. And so these birds are able to scatter hoard because of the neural density in their hippocampus. And that hippocampus is taking in a lot of information throughout the day when they're foraging, and then moving that into working memory. And they can tap into that and remember all the thousands of places that they stash their food throughout the fall and parts of the winter months. Okay, so I like to tell people about this problem centering tool. It's great for conservation organizations. So you've probably done something similar here, but HIPPO is something that E.O. Wilson came up with. And if you don't know E.O. Wilson, he passed away in the last 2 years, but he's a conservationist who did a lot for naturalists. And he's kind of like a Jane Goodall type. But he didn't get the glory from studying primates. He studied ants, so he didn't get popular in the ways that Jane Goodall did, but kind of a similar type of character, just did so much. And so, HIPPO stands for a couple things here. We'll get into each one, but for us here, our HIPPO first one is habitat, and we have a lot of development from renewables on the way. We'll probably have, just in Nevada, about 2 million acres go up for solar development in the next few years, which is quite a lot. It's going to change this landscape forever. And of course, transmission lines have to run from these locations, and there'll be highways and things like that. So we tell people we need to be very careful about the placement of these things, where we put them. We have some invasive species, not like California, but we do have things like tamarisk and Phragmites, Russian olive, and probably number one for us is tamarisk. Reducing the number of tamarisk that's in our wetlands. Pollution, this can include chemical atmospheric pollution, so moving methane or carbon into the atmosphere, light pollution, pollution of our watersheds and plastic, pesticides, neonicotinoids, insecticides. Climate change is pretty big, obviously, and neonicotinoids are a really big deal kind of everywhere because they kind of kill every insect, and that gets a little bit any amount assimilated into its body tissue and kills it. And that's no good for birds, because birds sometimes need to eat insects. Sometimes they have to eat a lot of them. Sometimes they have to feed their young lots of insects. So that's a big thing, a big conversation. Population, we have a lot of limitations in the Mojave. We can't really grow into areas that don't have a lot of water. And fortunately, people are starting to really realize water is a limiting factor in the Mojave. We can't just grow kind of out of control in areas that doesn't have water security. So we're waking up a little bit slowly. And overexploitation, we don't really have a big problem with overexploitation of birds in the Mojave Desert. And that is because we just don't have that much hunting. It's more of it's a bigger deal in fisheries, like with shrimp or certain species of fish, not so much affecting birds. But, what I do know is that with at least hunting, that because ducks typically pair bond in the wintertime, but that's also the time that people are hunting. Sometimes they'll maybe shoot one of the birds that has mated or bonded, and now they don't have their mate to go travel up with to wherever they're going to go breed, because they bond early, not at the breeding site, but in the winter. That's in general for duck species. So I hope that this is useful to see. It's our way of kind of looking at all the problems and then thinking, okay, what are the biggest deals for us to concentrate on? And what can we actually do things about? Like, what is actionable and what is not actionable? What is really important to do and what's not so important to do? And so, getting it all out on the table and looking at it and asking some questions is really good for us to do, and probably anyone to do, because we want to be certain that what we're working on is most essential. So, this is something that I came up with. You're in Las Vegas, if you haven't, a million times before, and here's some places that you can go to the next time that you're birding in Las Vegas. We have the Las Vegas Strip right kind of in the center, just west of the UNLV campus. That's a great place to bird. That's about where I live. And then some of our very popular places are on the right-hand side of the screen. Your Henderson Bird Viewing Preserve. That's the biggest eBird hotspot in Nevada. Clark County Wetlands Park, also very popular. It's got cottonwoods and willows, and they've done a great job there with their nature trails. And then in general, we have some places that have lakes and ponds and surface water. Those places are very birdy. Places that don't have a lot of surface water, less birdy. And of course, you get out in the deserts and the mountains, Red Rock Canyon, Joshua Tree National Park, Death Valley. You know how it goes. You'll be in some areas, not a lot of bird diversity sometimes, but just go to a different plant community at a different elevation, find some water, and voila, you have more bird diversity. So looking at the time here, I see 7:44. I try to keep this to 45 minutes, and this is the last slide. So I made it. I hope that you're still with me. And that concludes it. If you would like to send me an email, if you have questions, I try to answer those promptly. I get a lot of emails, and sometimes I'm traveling for a while. I'm pretty good about not letting them accumulate, but there's my email. So now you have it. And there's my number. Please don't try to sell me something or prank call me.